Namaskar, this is Akhilesh Bhargav. Welcome to Tit-Bits on Business and Finance with me. The main thrust of the global action led by the US and the European nations against what they call Russia's war crimes is that of economic and financial sanctions being imposed on Russia. The purpose of such sanctions is to isolate Russia from the world economy and thus cripple the Russian economy as the cost that it has to pay for being a blatant aggressor. These sanctions at present include freezing the forex reserves of about $630 billion of the Russian central bank lying with banks abroad. They include banning any transaction with Russia in the US dollar, in the British pound, and in the euro, thus disabling its international trade. It includes freezing the assets, freezing travel and other transactions of specified Russians and their companies, which include Putin and his foreign minister, and also of those oligarchs who are considered to be close to him. It includes blocking many Russian banks from the SWIFT messaging system, which is considered to be the backbone of international finance today. It includes banning technology transfers and blocking airspace of various nations to prevent the flight of any Russian aircraft. These sanctions are huge, unprecedented, and already far tougher than those imposed ever before on any nation by nations in the world. What has not been imposed so far are what are called secondary sanctions, which would be similar sanctions being imposed on any individual, any company or country which violates these sanctions and chooses to do business with Russia or all those specified Russians and their entities. Such a person or an entity would be cut off from doing business with America and Americans and also the Europeans if they decide to join these secondary sanctions, despite that person not being a Russian entity under these present sanctions. The international backlash and anger against Russia for its naked aggression in Ukraine is so severe that it would not be surprising if such secondary sanctions are also announced by the US, which would thus prevent anybody from dealing with Russia and Russian entities. With the SWIFT ban put in place, Russia's trade is already suffering and it will rapidly decline at least till alternate mechanisms are put in place by it. So let's talk about the Indo-Russia trade. With such sanctions kicking in, the India-Russia trade, which is at about $10 billion this year, too will be severely affected. Last year, our imports from Russia were worth about $5.5 billion and the exports to it were to the tune of $2.6 billion. India's main imports from Russia consist of defense equipment, mineral resources, precious stones, semi-precious stones, fertilizers, nuclear power equipment and electrical machinery. And our key items of export include pharma goods, organic chemicals, electrical machinery, iron and steel, tea, apparel, vehicles, spare parts, etc. The trade volume between the two nations is not quite significant in total numbers for either of them. Russia is ranked number 32 for exports from India and number 20 for imports into India. And for Russia, its exports to India were a mere 0.8% of its total exports, while the imports from India were a minuscule 1.5% of its total imports. India's main item of import has been defense equipment, with Russia supplying about 49.4% of our arms imports in 2016-2020 period. The ratio has fallen from about almost 70% during 2011 to 2015, with India now relying more and more on the USA and other Western nations for its arms supplies. The imposition of these sanctions will certainly impact India's trade, not just with Russia and Ukraine, but also with the entire CIS bloc of nations and with Europe too. Trade in commodities like sunflower oil, for example, of which India imports 3.5 lakh tons per annum from Russia and Ukraine, will be affected. With these developments, the ECGC has already increased the credit risk rating of Russia. It now gives credit risk insurance cover for Indian exports to Russia only on a case to case basis and not as freely as it did earlier, and that is on account of the rising risks in the region. While the war intensifies, the likes of Moody's and Fitch have already downgraded Russia's credit rating to junk, and all that is resulting in rising insurance premium for trade with Russia. It is resulting in difficulty in getting credit guarantee cover for exports. It is resulting in restricted payment options, currency fluctuations, non-availability of ships and containers, longer shipment times, and of course, huge volatility and uncertainty in international trade. It's not just India which is being impacted, but anybody and everybody which is engaged in international trade, not just with Russia, but with other nations also. That explains why banks like State Bank of India have decided not to process any new transaction involving Russian entities which are subject to international sanctions being imposed on them on account of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. State Bank has a large international presence and it will have to comply with sanctions imposed by the US, the EU, and the European nations on Russia. The newspaper Business Line reports that most Indian banks also remain cautious and are monitoring the developments given the decision by many countries to bar several Russian banks from the SWIFT system. Another report at the Economic Times says that oil PSUs of India, which is ONGC, Oil India, Indian Oil Corporation, and BPCL, have massive investments in multiple Russian oil and gas fields. The sanctions and the exclusion of Russian lenders from the SWIFT system, which is the most important international payment network today, will hurt the ability of India's oil PSUs to repatriate their dividends from the Russian oil fields, and that the sharp depreciation of the rupee against the dollar, which has already taken place, will also reduce the emanating dividends that our oil PSUs receive in dollar terms. The exclusion of Russian banks from SWIFT, as also the massive sanctions imposed on Russia, may slow down the Indo-Russian trade, but they cannot stop it. It is not just about trade, but it is also about national strategy and international relationships, with it therefore being in the interest of both the nations to not rupture the time-tested relations between the two countries by stopping or reducing trade. And for that, the two nations will need to restore the rupee-ruble trade in order to avoid being hit by these sanctions. They will need to conduct bilateral trade and payments in their national currencies in order to avoid any trade disruption which has already taken place across the board globally. This ruble-rupee trade arrangement is not something new. The two nations began the rupee-ruble trade since 1953 under the Indo-Soviet Trade Agreement, with the Indian exports to USSR being a fraction of the USSR exports to India. The then Soviet Union was saddled with huge rupee balances, and this arrangement was therefore stopped in 2005. But such trade arrangements have continued thereafter wherever it was needed to do so. Alrosa PGSC, a Russian company which is the world's biggest producer and exporter of rough diamonds in carat terms, has been trading with Indian companies in rupees since 2018. To avoid American sanctions under CAATSA, India has been even making payments for importing the $5 billion S-400 Triumph air defense systems in rubles and not in dollars. Data says that such trade, which is the rupee-ruble trade, has gone up fivefold during 2014 to 2019, and that it will only go up further. The Department of Commerce has already mooted such a proposal, which is under active consideration by the Finance Ministry. Such rupee-ruble trade will be transacted and paid for through a designated public sector bank, which has to be one which has no overseas branches, so that it is kept outside the ambit of these sanctions which have been imposed by the US and other nations. That is just what we did. When the then UCO Bank, which had no overseas branches, was designated as the payment bank for oil imports from Iran, despite the US sanctions which have been put in place. The larger picture to us is that Russia is too big a resource-rich nation and that it cannot be ignored or isolated like a North Korea or an Iran, which incidentally continue to trade with the world under alternate mechanisms despite the stringent sanctions which have been imposed on them by the US. As the biggest gas supplier to Europe, even the European Union cannot completely stop trading with Russia, which explains why, though many Russian banks have been blocked from SWIFT, its two large banks, which is the Sberbank and the Gazprom Bank, have been not blocked under SWIFT since they receive payments for Russia's gas exports to the European nations. Even China, which is a big buyer of Russian oil and gas, has said that it will not join the US and the EU nations in imposing financial sanctions on Russia. China says that it disapproves the financial sanctions since they are unilateral and that it says they have no legal basis. It also says that it opposes the sanctions and that it will keep normal trade and financial exchange with Russia. The issues here, as far as India is concerned, are numerous. Let's talk about them. The first issue is that the sanctions will certainly affect India too, but it will soon resort to the time-tested trading mechanism of the Rouble-Rupee trade arrangement, and thus the bilateral trade between the two nations will continue. Only the payment and banking mechanism of such trade between India and Russia will change once the Rupee-Ruble mechanism is put in place. The second issue, India's trade volumes with Russia are little, but then, as we said, it is not only about trade volumes. It is about international relations. It is about national strategy too, with defense playing a key role in the trade basket between the two nations, and India cannot ignore that. The third is that such trade mechanisms are not new to India and to Russia, and it is only a matter of time before they are fully operationalized and normal trade would continue between the two nations. The next is that with trade channels blocked for it, Russia will be keen to ramp up its trade with and through India, which is a plus for us, and it might just be better for us in terms of trade coming in favor in terms of the volumes and also in terms of the value. If the Ukraine war turns out to be more prolonged and bloodier, then India will need to maintain the rupee-ruble trade at a minimum level in order to avoid global criticism and to avoid potential secondary sanctions for siding with Russia, which Ukraine now labels as a terrorist state. The fact is that the global anger against Russia is so huge today that sanctions against it will continue for long, unless, of course, in the most unlikely situation of President Putin being dethroned and Russia atones for its war crimes. That looks extremely unlikely, and that means that the alternate means of trading with Russia, which is a rupee-ruble trade, is here to stay. India's trade mechanisms, India's balance of trade is bound to undergo a change with the rupee-ruble trade coming into place. This is Akhilesh Bhargav signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.